I think there's two counter arguments to the regulations. One, as an engineer and perhaps someone that's interested in looking after the environment, you think they could have gone a lot further with the regulations. And then the other side of that is the feedback that I've had from fans is that Formula One haven't really done anything to increase the noise from the engine or the I think everyone wants to go back to loud, old, manually aspirated engines, and they thought perhaps that this e-fuel would be the answer for that, which I can't answer if that is right or wrong, but what we've ended up with is a kind of half and half, and you've not really pacified the engineers, you've not really pacified the fans. So you could argue whether this is a good package of regulations or not. I think everyone has a slightly different opinion.
Looks to me that the regulations were written with how can we get as many new manufacturers as possible into the sport in mind. I
think that probably was a very large motivational factor for how the regulations were worded, particularly with the loss of the MGU-H on the hybrid system, which, for the incumbent manufacturers now is something, that R&D cost has been absorbed, and they now have, by and large, a relatively reliable heat hybrid package. So the question is, was that a stumbling block for people like BMW, Porsche, Audi, potentially Toyota, even Honda retaining a stronger interest in the sport? Was that the payoff that we had to have along with the e-fuel, which, again, kind of underwrites the ecological credentials of the combustion power unit? So, yeah, as I say, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and I think if you look at it completely on balance, I'm relatively happy with it, but you can see that the fringes really aren't happy with quite how much compromise there's been on either side.
Well, let's talk about the ecological fringe, 50% electrification. You're suggesting you'd like to have seen even more than that?
No, I think that's actually a good balance, personally, and I think it's a strong statement from the FIA saying that, only half of the horsepower coming out of this engine is going to come from burning not even fossil fuels, but burning fuel and creating emissions. So I think actually that 50-50 is the right direction, and I think Formula One can continue to go further and further by downsizing the combustion unit and being much more reliant on recovered energy to power the car. And there's still lots of lost opportunities. You've got the front axle regenerative braking, which isn't part of this regulations. You have the energy lost through the turbocharger, which was that the heat hybrid system has been lost as well. So there is even more scope to recover more energy. But what we haven't seen with the regulations, and the reason perhaps that I'm a little bit dissatisfied, is that it's a package of regulations for 2026 and not really a roadmap of where we're going to go over the subsequent years and what are the next steps. So this really is only like the first line in the sand. But overall, I think the fact that we can, run half of the energy needed for a lap comes from recovered energy is incredible. And I think people need to be talking about that more and much less about how much noise comes out of the exhaust pipe.
Well, let's just talk about that end of the fringe, though. Is there any more they could have done within the general framework of where they're going to pacify the we want more noise, more burning fuel brigade?
Yes, there are things they could have done. I think the whole question then revolves around the e-fuel. So they've got a fully sustainable fuel which will be powering the cars from 2026. This is a petrol that is effectively not made from any fossil fuels or hydrocarbons. And, there's lots of arguments about how sustainable that is, because obviously it doesn't require you to use up our resources of fossil fuels. And equally, it's, a very short-term cycle of storing carbon and then releasing carbon, and relatively low emissions in lots of other respects when it is actually burning that fuel. So that really goes a long way. So I think the fans thought, well, we've got a sustainable fuel, though. Let's go back to V10s and have super loud engines, or let's increase the fuel flow, have a very powerful combustion engine, and let's see flames coming out of the exhaust as you go through corners. I don't think that sets the correct statement for what Formula One wants to be doing in terms of, its environmental credentials. But yet still fans do, there's a big body of fans that want that. And I don't think Formula One at the moment is communicating the reasons why and why not this is going on. I think there is more that could be done with the noise. So we have, again, I keep saying we've lost the MGUH, and that will allow a little bit more noise, but we've got a lot less fuel flow. The engines could produce in far less horsepower than it is now. So that again means that you're producing slightly less noise to balance that off. I think there are things that they could have done with the audio, with the length of the exhausts, how they're shaped, how the TV in particular picks it up, because what you hear on TV is not what you hear around the track, and it certainly isn't what you hear when you're standing in the pit lane. These engines are noisy. They do have a really interesting exhaust note. I mean, they're not super loud like the even F2, F3 engines or the old V8s are, but there is something to hear there, and I think the FIA and Formula One could do a lot more to translate that into what the fans can hear. So, yeah, again, I think there were some promises made when these regulations were being thought about, and I don't think that they've been fulfilled with this packet of rules.
Do you think that the internal combustion engine, as it is now, is the right package?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we're at is you're going to have this incredibly efficient engine. It's going to be burning hardly any fuel, still producing, 500 horsepower, but it won't have quite the same impact on the car's performance. I'm happy with that, but again, I think that there are other messages that could come out here. Again, I think there was this roadmap of where we're going forward. We're going to reduce it down from a V6 1.6 to maybe a V4 1 litre, much more in keeping with what we're seeing on the road. Maybe even saying at some point that the engine will be merely there to generate the electricity for electric final drive. I just think there's a lack of direction, and I think fans are still a little bit confused as to what would happen next. Are we going to go back, if this e-fuel's a success, are we going to go back to relying much more on the combustion engine than on energy recovery? And again, I just think that there's a message and a story to be told, and it hasn't come out yet, and I think that's important.
Do you think a V8 was potentially on the table, and that maybe that could have pacified some people? Because it's got a nice ring to it, a V8, in terms of Formula One's heritage.
Yeah, it does. And again, I think you kind of just need to decide, what are we doing with this sport? Is it going to be something that, I hate to use the term road relevant, but something that kind of reflects where we are in the world today? We know that there's a climate emergency. I don't think there's a lot of doubt about that, although some may argue. And I think Formula One, while it doesn't necessarily need to, in itself, reduce its carbon output, I think it needs to be sending a message so that you have sponsors and manufacturers and fans don't feel bad about following the sport because it's a gas-guzzling monster. So I actually think, if anything, the engine does continue to need to be downsized and be more reliant on recovering energy, which is effectively free from what you produce from petrol in the first place. To simply throw that away, and I think a lot of people did say, let's go back to a V8, let's have no electrification, no KERS, no ERS, no hybrid systems. And I don't think that is necessarily the right message. And I still feel that the mix of combustion and hybrid systems for the short to medium term is the right direction for Formula One to take, and I think it needs to really kind of sell that message.